What is going on, guys? My name is Aaron, and welcome to the very first installment of Tackle Tips Thursday. Tackle Tips Thursday is a series I've been wanting to start for a while. It's going to be for my current and for my new subscribers, and the core to Tackle Tips Thursday is to save you all money. I've been fishing for about 6 years now. I've gotten really into fishing, and I've spent a lot of money on fishing. So my goal at the end of the day is to take the lessons that I've learned, pass those lessons on to you all, so you guys don't have to waste the money that I've wasted, and you guys can be a lot more efficient with your dollars. Today we're going to start off with the topic of braid to leader. Now when I say braid to leader, typically I'm meaning braid to a fluorocarbon leader. You can do fluorocarbon to fluorocarbon, you can do braid to mono, but when we talk about braid to leader, we're mostly talking about braid to fluorocarbon leader. Just to give you guys a spoiler alert of where I stand on braid to leader, I absolutely love it. And I think there's a misconception when we say braid to leader because that can mean a couple different things. So I'm going to go into multiple meanings of what that means and what that looks like. But when we say braid to leader, most of the time people think of spooling your entire spinning reel or bait casting reel up with braid and then tying an 8 to 10 foot fluorocarbon leader. So yes, that is braid to leader. When I'm talking about braid to leader as well, I'm either talking about spooling up 75% or 50% of your reel with braid and then tying the rest up with fluorocarbon as well. And we'll kind of get into the different uses for things. Again, you guys already know my opinion off the bat. I love braid to fluorocarbon. It saves me a ton of money, and I think there's a bunch of pros to it, but we'll get into those a little bit later. First, I want to kind of explore the opposite side of the argument. So there's not many people who argue against braid to leader, but there are a few people, especially on YouTube, who are against braid to fluorocarbon, and that's totally okay. This is made mainly for people who are neutral or people who are curious about the subject. Obviously, if straight fluorocarbon works best for you, that's fine. You use what works best for you. But these are the reasons why I really prefer braid to fluorocarbon or braid to leader in general. So the number one argument I've heard for not tying braid to leader is it takes too long to tie the knot. When we go fishing, guys, we should be prepared the night before, right? So we should have all our knots fresh. We should make sure there's no nicks in our line, and the braid to leader is no exception with that. Yes, throughout the day, your leader might get shorter depending on how often you're switching up your lures, and you might have to retie your braid to leader knot. But at the end of the day, practice makes perfect. So the more we tie that knot, the better off we are, and then the quicker we can tie it when we're in the water. So we should be able to be out on our boat in 25-mile-an-hour winds and tie our braid to fluorocarbon knot just like we would our regular knot, say like as a Palomar knot. We should be able to tie it just as easy, and practice makes perfect in that sense. Another argument I've heard is you have two knots, so two weaknesses instead of one. That is sort of a valid point, but that's also sort of a misnomer. And the reason why it is because if you have a very good knot, so you're using the correct line strength, I'm using 17-pound fluorocarbon on a jig. I don't typically ever break off that jig on 17-pound fluorocarbon because I'm tying a Palomar knot and that knot is solid. It's the exact same way when it comes to the leader knot, guys. If you're tying your leader knot and your leader knot is solid and it's good, you have a very slim chance of breaking that leader knot off. So to me, when people say that there's two knots instead of one, how often does your normal knot break? If it's about 0.2% chance, then your leader knot's probably going to be about the same once you learn to tie it and once you practice enough with that knot. The other argument I've heard is it makes you lazy. Now this argument completely blows my mind because it's literally the opposite of lazy. If you're the type of person who gets nicks in your lines and doesn't retie your line, you're going to be the type of person who doesn't retie your braid to fluorocarbon or braid to leader knot when it gets down to too short amount. So to say that it makes you more lazy, I think is completely absurd. I think that's a ridiculous argument. If you're lazy, you're going to be lazy. If you're not lazy, you're going to be not lazy. That's the way I look at it. Sure, there's a potential there for someone to be more lazy, but if they're serious about fishing and they're serious about catching big fish, they're going to do what it takes in order to land those fish, which is really maintaining your knots, whether that's your knot tied onto the lure or whether that's your braid to leader knot. So why do I love braid to leader? The number one reason is it saves you money. It saves you so much money, guys. You can spool up 50%, 75%, or 90% of your spool with braid, and you can keep it on for probably 2 seasons. If you fish really hard, 1 season most likely, and you're gonna have to replace that braid. But with fluorocarbon, you're guaranteed to have to replace that whole spool every single year. It's gonna develop memory, it's gonna be weaker, you're gonna have to replace it. So braid to fluorocarbon at the end of the day saves massive amounts of money. More sensitivity. So I love braid to fluorocarbon, and specifically I'm talking about that 10 to 12 foot leader when I'm fishing bottom baits, whether that's on a spinning rod like a drop shot, whether that's a jig, anything that's on the bottom, anything I'm dragging, I love braid to leader. Two different reasons for that. Number one reason is it does give you more sensitivity. So braid is going to have more sensitivity than fluorocarbon. And number two is you get that visual aspect of it. I typically always use a high vis when I'm using high vis braid when I'm using braid to leader. And the reason why I do that is because if a fish picks it up and starts moving with it, you can see it. If your line jumps, you can see it a lot easier than you can see fluorocarbon. Especially on a sunny day, you're looking directly into the water. It's very, very hard to see your fluorocarbon jump or your fluorocarbon move. But if you have like a high vis yellow braid on there, it's so much easier to see. So not only does it save money, not only does it give you more sensitivity, it also helps you detect those bites easier. And then obviously bass, the bass visibility, how the bass can see the bait. So I would prefer to fish braid to leader all day over straight braid if I can. There is situations where you do fish straight braid. There are certain techniques where you do fish straight braid. But at the end of the day, I prefer braid to leader. Now, let me kind of go over the different techniques and the different lures where you're gonna use a different backing system. So again, there's times where I use 50% backing, there's times where I use 75% backing, and there's times where I use 90% backing. What are those three different things? So the ones I'm using the 50% backing for are things that I exclusively want to fish on fluorocarbon. Those baits would be baits like a spy bait and baits like a jerk bait. So those two things I exclusively want to fish on fluorocarbon. I don't want any braid ever coming out of that. So I would, in that sense, or in that situation, what I would do is I would put a 50% backing of braid on my spinning rod or on my bait casting rod, and then the other 50% would be fluorocarbon. The reason why I would do that is because I'm never going to have any of that braid coming out. That knot's never going to be exposed. It's never coming out of my guides. And then that should last me about all year. If I need to replace it halfway through the year, I can. But again, those are for situations where I do not want any braid coming out of the reel. The next one would be the 75% method. So what am I using that for? That method is really good for things like crankbaits, chatterbaits, any sort of moving bait. Again, the reason why we're using a high vis braid to a leader is because we really want to be able to detect the bite. If we're using a lure like a chatterbait or a crankbait or a spinnerbait, we don't need to be able to see that bite because we're going to be able to feel it before we can see it. So as you're reeling along, you're going to feel that bite and then you're going to set the hook, right? So you don't need that high vis braid coming out. Now, the reason why I say 75% is because I don't mind if a little bit comes out at the end. So basically, that 75% will last me probably a month or two. I would say about a month, just to be fair. It'll last me about a month before it starts coming out. When it starts coming out, when I start to get to that 75%, I know it's time to put a fresh leader on there. And again, I'm putting 25% of my spool as a leader. So really, this is more of a backing method as opposed to braid to leader. So that's when I'll use the 75% method. That's going to be for moving baits. And then the last method is going to be the 90% method. This is, again, you have about a 10 to 12 foot leader. Things I'm going to use this for, again, bottom baits. Baits you're crawling, baits you're moving slow, baits you really need that bite detection on. So jigs, drop shots, those are the main things. Texas rigs, obviously. Those are the main things that I will use, that I prefer to use braid to leader on, are those things. So again, when the braid to leader conversation comes up, we have to define what we're talking about, because are we talking about backing or are we talking about braid to leader? I'm all for it because I know that I can keep braid on there for about 2 years, 1 to 2 years, as opposed to if I fill my entire spool with fluorocarbon, you're probably going to waste most of that fluorocarbon. So tell me what you guys think in the comments, guys. Leave a comment to whether you guys use braid to leader or whether you all just go straight fluoro. I'm going to be making more videos on these tips. The next video that's probably going to come up is why you're losing fish, and that has to do a lot with the power of your rods. So be sure to subscribe, hit the bell for notifications, and we'll see you guys on the next video. Thank you all and have a blessed day.